Hey, welcome back to my channel. This is Joel Duff, and I just saw a video by a young Earth creationist talking about the preservation of fossil footprints. And providentially, I just started a series on flood geology failures, and my first example of a flood geology failure is the failure to explain the presence of billions of fossil footprints in the geological column. And so we're going to listen to a 1-minute snippet that was just in a Q&A session of a young Earth creationist talk from just this past week or a week ago. And we're going to see what they have to say about fossil footprints, and then we'll compare that to these particular footprints you're looking at right here, which is our 2 theropod footprints with my son for scale at the Red Gulch Dinosaur trackway in the Bighorn Basin of Montana. So that's what we got coming up next. So before we get to that 1-minute snippet, I want to introduce you to the fossil trackway that I'm going to talk a little bit about in contrast to what we're going to hear. And that's found at the Big Gulch Dinosaur trackway in the Great Basin, or the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming. A few years back, took my family out for a vacation, and we spent a week in this particular area. We went to Yellowstone as well during that time, but we spent most of our time out here in the desert of the Bighorn Basin searching for fossils. Here are 2 of my kids for scale at this particular gulch, right? You see this is a dry stream bed, and it's the bed of this stream here, this rocky bed you see in the bottom left-hand corner, that preserves over 1,000 dinosaur footprints, along with a bunch of other ichnofossils, including clams, shrimp burrows, and a variety of other things that you might find along a beach or a mud flat or tidal flat. And so here my kids are actually looking for clam shells in the layers of rock that are found above this limestone layer, a hard layer that represents the floor of this stream bed. So this represents the reality of the fossil record, right? You're looking at a cross-section of a small portion of the geological column. And on this one bedding plane, we have thousands of dinosaur footprints. Looks like all the same kind of dinosaur. All right, so probably the same species, or at least same general type of theropod. And there's actually an area called the dance floor. All right, they call it because there's simply so many footprints, and they're all in different orientations. So it's not just a group of dinosaurs walking in one particular direction, but they're all over the place. These types of footprints found on the fossil record, right, need some kind of explanation. How did they get preserved, right? We often think about footprints as being ephemeral things, right? That once we put our foot in mud or step on the sand and leave our print, that it soon will be washed away or blown away. And yet the fossil record, as I said in my first part of this series, and we'll continue to talk a lot more in detail about, contains innumerable fossil footprints in hundreds of different layers, well, really thousands and thousands of layers of rock, each of which contain many different footprints of different types of animals. And so how do we explain that? How is that explained? And flood geology has one explanation. And flood geology is the idea that the whole world was covered by a flood 4,350 years ago. And all these layers of rock, including all the layers that you see before you right here that my kids are examining, would have been all laid down pretty much all at the same time. And how did fossil footprints get placed in layers, right, between layers of these sediments? As you're going to hear in the video that I'm going to play, they claim that only a global flood can explain these footprints. And so can we explain these footprints in the context of an ancient Earth? I think the answer is an obvious yes. And it's this series that I'm going to be doing of a number of different locations and footprints in the world, and we're going to look at the geological context, that we're going to show that flood geology as an explanation for this particular type of fossil is completely inadequate. And so therefore it's a failure to be able to explain this type of fossil evidence. But let's get to it. We got to get to that video. So while you're watching this video, in the background, I've got some more obvious dinosaur footprints, and this is from the Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado, a very famous site where there is, again, thousands of footprints on one particular sheet of limestone. And here we have actually a couple different species of dinosaurs, all living in community in the same area. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at just a 1-minute answer to a question from Creation Day from ICR. Now, Creation Day was a conference that they put on April 20, I think it was either 22nd or 23rd, which corresponds to Earth Day. All right. And so their response to Earth Day is to have Creation Day. And they had a number of speakers talking about young Earth creationism and how the world is young and the features of the Earth can be explained by a young Earth. And then there was some talk about sort of the climate within the perspective of, within the young Earth perspective. And that is the response to what they consider to be the secular view of climate change. But that's not our interest here. I'm just giving you the context of this particular talk. And there was much discussion of the geological column during this time and what it can tell us and what it can't tell us. And it's to that there was a number of questions at the end of the conference. And I'm showing you the answer to one of those. So here we go. This is Jake Hebert, I believe, providing the answer to a question from the audience. Okay, let's give it a listen.
So we find tracks, specifically mentioned here, dinosaur tracks, in sand or mud. What mechanism caused the soil to suddenly become rock without disturbing the tracks, and why is this not repeated now?
Okay, perfectly natural question. I would understand why many people who don't know science very well have seen fossils, and then when they confront something like fossil footprints, they have it's intuitive to think that how could footprints be preserved? I mean, footprints seem so ephemeral. They're so easy to destroy. You can't imagine that your own footprints are being preserved and could be preserved in stone someday. And so it's natural to ask, like, where do these footprints come from? How could we possibly explain them? And that's the question to Jake Hebert here. The thing is the person asking the question has a misconception, right? They're not right when they say at the very end of the question, but we don't see this happening today. How could this have happened in the past when we don't see footprints being preserved today? We absolutely do see footprints being preserved today. And I showed one really simple example in my first part of this series on flood geology failures. And I'm going to show many more examples of footprints that are being preserved or have been preserved in the fairly recent past, meaning just a few thousand years. And so it's not a question of how could this have happened in the past when it doesn't happen in the present. And this is why Jake Hebert's answer, as we're going to see, is going to be, well, of course, there's only one possible answer. Since it doesn't happen today and it happened in the past, it must be the flood, because the flood is a unique event. We don't have a global flood going on today. So the conditions of a global flood aren't occurring now, but they did occur in the past, and there's footprints in the past. Today, we don't see footprints being preserved, so therefore it's the flood. All right, now I'm just saying what he's going to say. Why don't we just hear it from Hebert himself?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it sort of depends. I think that you can have the...
By the way, I'm not really an expert on this either. It's not like this is my specific field of study, and I haven't explicitly studied and researched, done actual research on actual footprints. I've read a lot of papers on those. And so I'm not an expert in that sense, but I will say that I'm far more of an expert on this than Jake Hebert is, and his particular answer here. But his answer does reflect the typical young Earth creationist or creation scientist answer to this particular question.
Waves, if they come in too fast, they can destroy the tracks. But then if they come in too slow, they don't get buried. So there's kind of a balance you need. But you do need you need for them to be buried quickly in order for them to be preserved. And
Now, you might be wondering, especially if you don't know flood geology very well, what's he talking about if the waves come in too fast versus too slowly? He's saying if the waves come in too fast, it's going to destroy the footprints. if it comes in too slowly, they won't be preserved. And what's he talking about? He's talking about this model of a global flood in which you can think of it as the water is sloshing around the entire earth, right? The chaos of the eruption of the flood and the water flowing over the whole earth churns up all the soil over the whole earth, and now all these layers are being settling out of that, even during walls. But there's these tidal waves, essentially giant waves that are moving across the earth, and as they move across the earth and then they deposit more sediment, as they go by, there are areas that are higher elevation that get exposed, right? And so don't think of it as like in the middle of the flood, every single square inch of the earth was covered with water. At any one time, there's like little patches of land as the water is moving across the earth. I know some young earth creationists might dispute that and say that at some point the entire earth had to be covered, but a lot of creationists will have sort of this mixed model. And so as the wave goes by, and then there is a giant, wide, like sandy beach left, right, that's exposed. And okay, but wait a second, where do the footprints come from? Well, the footprints come from animals that are still alive, despite this maybe being several months into this global flood. Because remember, we're talking about layers of sediment that are way up high. There's tens of thousands of feet of sediment underneath a place just like I'm showing you here. And all of that sediment had to be deposited before you had this particular layer of sediment exposed to the surface, to the air, after one of these waves sloshes by. And then animals still had to be alive at that point. Dinosaurs specifically in this case, several different species of dinosaurs all had to be alive at this particular place and moment in time. And how did they do that? Apparently they were floating on mats of logs displaced by the global flood and sort of hanging on, right, for dear life. And they've managed to survive for a couple months or at least several weeks on these particular logs. And then they see this, wave go by, and there's this mud flat. All right, actually mud flat would not really be right because it's probably not going to be mud. Mud is fine particles, and they're not going to sort themselves out on a beach. So like a sandy beach. And then they get off their log mat and they run across the beach and they leave their footprints. And so what Jake here was saying, if the next tidal wave came by like instantly after that, it's going to have a lot of force, and it's basically going to erode the surface as well as deposit new soil, and therefore you're going to lose all those fossil footprints. But if it happens too slowly, right, if it takes another couple days for the next wave to come by, well, then the sand is going to also get maybe blown away, or I don't know, if the water rises very slowly, it's going to end up kind of mixing, and you're not going to get a clear new layer of sediment on top. It's actually quite unclear to me exactly what he thinks is really going to be happening with slow waves versus fast waves, because I don't think it really makes a whole lot of sense. And then he's kind of like saying, but there's a sweet spot, right? It's kind of like, if it's just right, if it's not too hot, if it's not too cold, if it's just right, and the waves are just like not too forceful, but not too mild, you'll end up with the perfect conditions for preserving footprints. And this has to happen in multiple different layers in different places all over the earth. So apparently there's animals alive all over the earth well into the flood, and they're all like just frantically trying to find places to survive, and therefore they're running across these sandy areas, leaving their footprints behind and getting preserved. And so the explanation here is that the reason there are footprints in the fossil record is because the global flood is the only thing that can provide the exact right conditions for preserving these footprints. Let's continue.
Really, the flood is by far the best explanation for that. So, I think there is an element where you have to it has to balance. The rate of burial has to be just right. But I don't know how do evolutionists explain it? You've got these tracks.
Right. So how do others explain it? How does somebody who believes the world may be very old and therefore there wasn't a global flood, but there was many different periods of time in the past in which you had maybe slow accumulation of sediments, and in his mind he's thinking uniformitarianism as well. He's like each layer took long times to preserve, and therefore it took a long time to cover these particular footprints. And like his whole thing with like if it's too slow, then the footprints are going to get eroded before they get covered in time, right? That's his sweet spot, right? They got to get covered quickly, but not too quickly, but not too slowly. How would that happen if there wasn't a global flood? Let's continue.
They don't get preserved on the beaches today.
That's what I'm waiting for. That's the whole reason I recorded this, this video, and I'm replaying this little snippet here for you, is that he says that we don't see this happening on the beaches today. All right. You know what? I would say that on your like sandy beaches, your typical beach where you're going to go, play in the waves with your kids. Yeah, you're really not going to see preservation of footprints there, right? Billions of footprints are being made. Billions of footprints are being washed away. There's not good preservation, if any preservation, at a location like that. But in my series, I am going to show actual footprints preserved on sand, right? But it's not usually sand that footprints are preserved in. And so again, there's an emphasis a lot of times the young earth creationists are talking about like, you can't preserve fossils, footprints in sand, but it's not sand that they're preserved in. I understand in their model with waves washing past and sediment being laid down really quick, that sediment is going to be like a sandy type sediment, not clay, right? Can't deposit clay as one thin layer really quick in just a few moments in time. They think of it as sand, all right? But this particular site, this is not sand you're looking at. And you're not looking at sand at my Red Gulch site either that I visited. That's limestone, all right? So that is this limey mud, right? Very dense mud and full of calcareous organisms as well that has been part of a tidal flat, been part of, by the way, limestone doesn't just get preserved in marine environments. There are actually freshwater environments also that can create a type of limestone too. But in this case, we think that this is some kind of like large tidal flat in which you have this mud. And that's what the dinosaurs are walking through, and that's what's getting preserved. This is not sand. This is a much finer sediment that's capturing the footprints and then allowing them to be preserved over time. We'll talk about that preservation in just a minute, but let me finish this off.
Something was causing them to be preserved in the past, and I think the flood is by far the best explanation for that.
All right, the flood's the best explanation for all that, right? But the flood doesn't explain preservation in limestone, right? Or in many other cases, we have preservation in volcanic ash, right? That's not a very good explanation for the global flood, right? To have a layer of volcanic ash in the middle of flood layers, like aqueous layers, right? What you're looking at here is this hard limestone that was part of a tidal flat in a very shallow sea, which has been well researched in terms of the mid-center part of North America, having a very large, very, very shallow sea. And that shallow sea, as it rose and went down, even just by a matter of a couple inches, would leave large areas, all right, large flat areas of mud flats. And so as tides came in and as even different seasonality with different amounts of input of water would raise the sea level in these inland seas. And therefore you'd have just slight flooding of areas. And so you get these large mud flats that have, you see these little depressions here, right, on the right side? That's not a footprint. Okay, in case you're wondering, that's not the dinosaur footprint. That's where large clams were. There's also on this limestone surface a bunch of places where you see where shrimp have dug holes in the mud. And then there's a bunch of other types of trace fossils that are typical of a marine mud flat tidal area. But this was also very close to land, right? So you had dinosaurs, and then they're walking across these open mud flats that are probably drying during certain parts of the year, or at least for maybe weeks at a time during different extreme weather events. And they're walking across this mud flat, and the mud flat is sure, it would have been like a squishy mud, but it's also very dense. And it also pretty clearly at this particular site was covered with an algal mat, right? And that there's a bunch of things about the fossils that are found here and the texture and the particular chemistry of the top layer of this limestone that suggests there's this algal mat probably covering this region. And so they're stepping onto that. And on the left-hand side, there's actually a three-toed dinosaur footprint there. It's not the clearest footprint in the world, right? It's this mooky stuff that when you push into it and then pull the foot back out, you're not going to get a perfect print. It all depends on exactly the conditions of the mud at that time. If it was drier, you might have gotten a more consistent print, right? But it's probably quite soft. And then being a tidally type of area, right? When the water or the sea level came up just a slight bit and covered this whole region again, or maybe what you had is water levels coming up, but you also had maybe large storms that are dragging down sediment from nearby hills that are on dry land, right? Well, wet land when it's raining, but that's dragging down a bunch of sediment, depositing it into this shallow sea along the shore, and then laying down another layer of sediment. And you saw that picture I had at the very beginning here. Let's see, let's go back to that. Right. All these layers here are various layers of shale, and they're also marine sediments, shallow marine sediments, and they're full of organisms that would be in a very shallow marine environment. And so it could be that the sea actually began to rise again and covered this region, and then you just have deposition from that. And what you have is you do have several layers of this more limestone or mudstone that would have been from times in which this particular area was more exposed to the air, at least part of the year it was exposed to the air. And so that's how you get this particular development, or this particular spot where that's where the dinosaur footprints are, whereas there's no footprints in the layers above it or below it, at least at this particular location. All right, so what we've got here is just an example of young earth creationists who are claiming that footprints aren't made and can't be made in present day environments along shorelines. But as we're going to see that there are places even today where people, right? We have a lot of human footprints. We have thousands of human footprints that are preserved, right? In either stone or something that's getting pretty close to being stone, all right? In the process of becoming solidified. And all of those, I think young earth creationists will have to admit, didn't happen during the flood. Those human footprints didn't get preserved during the flood. So clearly, there are times in which footprints can be preserved and it doesn't require a global flood. And well, look, there's lots of other examples. There are millions and millions of footprints that are preserved in rocks that young earth creationists believe are rocks that were formed after the flood, under conditions that are similar to today. And so they know that fossil footprints can be made in conditions that exist on the earth today. But I think they feed into the perception of their audience, which is that this is something that's really hard to do and doesn't happen today and requires special conditions. Well, yes, there are special conditions. In this case, it's got to be a type of mud that is dense enough to hold the footprint for long enough, and then conditions will be like, hey, and then the mud dries, right? Once it dries, this particular type of mud is going to be pretty hard. And then if you have a flood, a local flood, right? You have a stream, brings down a whole bunch of sediment and just lays out another layer of 4 inches of sediment on top. You've got footprints that are preserved. You lay a whole bunch of sediments on top of that, and pretty soon the whole thing begins to lithify, right? You begin to get this converting into a form of rock. All right, I don't want to go any further with this right now because, as I said, I've got a whole series of videos that's going to explore some specific fossil sites, and we can talk about the conditions of footprint preservation at those particular sites. It'll become much, much more evident that this really oversimplified view that footprints aren't made today and they're only made in the past and therefore they could only be made during a global flood is an absolute failure of flood geology to account for the actual observed footprints and their geological context. Yeah, let's leave it there. That's it. I got to go. Bye-bye.